During those scorching months of 1943, countless men who had worn the grey-green uniforms of the Wehrmacht found their circumstances radically transformed. Across the dusty battlefields of Tunisia and through the rocky terrain of Sicily, entire divisions laid down their weapons and shuffled into long columns under the watchful eyes of American soldiers. These captured fighters had been conditioned by years of relentless messaging from their own leadership to anticipate the absolute worst once they fell into enemy hands. The prevailing narrative back home suggested that surrender meant torture, starvation rations if any food at all, and likely death through forced labor or outright execution. The propaganda machine had worked overtime painting Allied forces, particularly the Americans, as barbaric and vengeful. Yet what transpired in those initial hours after capture bore little resemblance to the nightmare scenarios that had been drilled into their consciousness. The very first indication that reality might deviate sharply from expectation came through something as fundamental as a meal. In makeshift holding areas throughout North Africa, American quartermasters distributed field provisions to the newly surrendered Germans. These weren't scraps or mouldy leftovers, but actual military rations containing proper bread, tins of preserved meat, and in many instances, cigarettes. For soldiers who had spent their final weeks of combat subsisting on whatever meagre supplies could reach the crumbling Axis front lines, often nothing more than dried legumes boiled into watery broth or whatever could be scrounged from abandoned villages, the appearance of organized, substantial food distribution seemed almost incomprehensible. By the midpoint of that year, the logistical networks supporting German forces had already begun their slow unraveling. Frontline troops lived with persistent hunger as a constant companion. So when these same men, now prisoners, encountered systematic meal service under their captors, it immediately challenged everything they believed about what awaited the defeated. The comparison with other potential fates could not have been starker. Stories circulated among Wehrmacht units about comrades taken by Red Army forces, tales of brutal treatment, including endless marches without adequate water, minimal food provisions, and prison facilities where starvation was commonplace rather than exceptional. These accounts had spread through the ranks like wildfire, intensifying the terror associated with capture by any force, but especially by the Soviets. But here, under American control, the German prisoners witnessed something altogether different. Food appeared at regular intervals, distributed with clear organization, and the portions seemed adequate not just for survival, but for maintaining reasonable health. The guards themselves ate from similar stocks. This methodical approach to feeding stood out as both unexpectedly compassionate and remarkably efficient, particularly to men whose own supply systems had devolved into chaos. As the middle months of 1943 progressed, American military operations began the massive undertaking of transporting German captives across the Atlantic Ocean. Eventually, more than 400,000 of these prisoners would find themselves confined within camps scattered throughout the vast interior of the United States. Before embarking on these transoceanic voyages, many experienced temporary detention facilities in European locations where they received their first real exposure to the peculiarities of American military provisioning. For men whose expectations had been shaped by visions of stale bread crusts and thin, tasteless soup, the actual contents of American supply packages carried enormous symbolic weight. Canned beans, various preserved meat products, and strong coffee that bore no resemblance to the roasted grain substitutes they had grown accustomed to in Europe, all these items communicated something profound about the enemy that had defeated them. From the American perspective, this treatment was neither accidental nor particularly generous by their own standards. International agreements, specifically the Geneva Convention established in 1929, set clear requirements for the treatment of prisoners of war, and American authorities made genuine efforts to comply with these regulations. Beyond the legal obligations, there existed practical strategic considerations as well. Prisoners who received adequate nutrition caused fewer disciplinary problems, showed greater willingness to cooperate with camp authorities, and demonstrated less inclination toward escape attempts. In this framework, food functioned simultaneously as basic sustenance and as an instrument of control and order. German officers, trained to notice logistical operations, quickly observed how systematically the Americans managed their provisioning compared to the increasingly dysfunctional supply networks back in the Reich. Personal journals and later published recollections from various German prisoners reveal that those earliest meals under American supervision forced a fundamental reconsideration of the balance of military and industrial power. It proved difficult to maintain the image of a weak, decadent adversary when that same adversary calmly distributed food that was not merely edible, but genuinely ample by the standards of wartime scarcity that defined European existence. One former soldier who had fought with Rommel's forces in Africa later documented that the simple act of being offered coffee alongside milk and actual fruit preserves was sufficient to provoke utter disbelief among men who had endured months without such basic luxuries. The psychological impact ran deeper than mere gratitude for calories. From the very outset of their imprisonment, these German fighters encountered an aspect of their adversary that communicated volumes about industrial capability, organizational sophistication, and a fundamentally different cultural approach to warfare that emphasized abundance rather than the austere deprivation they had known. What began with simple bread and canned goods would soon expand into even more surprising territory, ultimately revealing to these captive soldiers that the American conception of military rations included items they could scarcely have imagined existing during the wartime conditions that had defined their experience in Europe. The American military establishment had, by the time global conflict erupted, constructed one of the most intricate and well-organized provisioning systems anywhere on Earth. Unlike the German Wehrmacht, which frequently relied on requisitioning foodstuffs from populations in occupied territories or improvising with whatever ingredients could be assembled into basic soups and bread substitutes made from ersatz grains, the United States Army placed tremendous emphasis on standardization and industrial-scale production methods. Starting in 1941, the Quartermaster Corps rolled out new categories of field rations specifically engineered for different combat scenarios and operational requirements. Among the most widely recognized were the K rations, designed with airborne troops and highly mobile units in mind, and the C rations, intended for sustained field deployment over extended periods. Each packaged unit contained precisely measured portions of canned meat products, hardtack biscuits, powdered beverage mixes, and confectionery items, reflecting not merely nutritional science, but also the staggering industrial capacity that the United States could bring to bear on any challenge, including the seemingly mundane task of feeding millions of people. In manufacturing facilities across the industrial heartland of America, from the sprawling factories of Chicago extending through the automotive production centers of Detroit, assembly lines operated around the clock producing millions upon millions of these ration packages. The Hershey Company received contracts to develop high-calorie chocolate bars designated as D bars, deliberately engineered to be extremely dense and resistant to melting even in tropical climates, though admittedly not particularly pleasant to the palate. These bars served the specific purpose of providing soldiers with emergency energy reserves during combat situations. Simultaneously, the development of more palatable sweet options, including the now famous M&Ms introduced to the market in 1941, reflected a sophisticated understanding of the crucial role that morale played in military effectiveness. Fighting men were not merely machines of war, but human beings requiring comfort and small pleasures, and candy played a recognized role in sustaining psychological resilience under the immense stress of combat operations. What would later shock German prisoners was not simply the sheer quantity of food available, but the remarkable variety presented. Where Axis soldiers had grown wearily accustomed to monotonous meals dominated by bread, potatoes, and ersatz coffee, made from roasted grain or chicory, American rations offered a rotating selection of different options. One distribution might contain canned spaghetti with meatballs, while the next featured beans cooked with bacon, accompanied by fruit preserves or even powdered drink mixes flavored with lemon. For Europeans who had come of age during the economic devastation of the Great Depression and then endured years of wartime rationing that progressively tightened, the sheer diversity contained within a single box of United States military rations seemed extraordinary, almost lavish. The military's systematic approach to feeding its own fighting forces directly influenced how it managed provisions for prisoners of war. According to the stipulations of the Geneva Convention, American officials determined that POWs would receive meals containing similar caloric content to what United States soldiers consumed, though typically prepared in separate facilities. Documentation from detention camps in Texas and Georgia reveals menus that routinely included white bread made from quality wheat flour, beef stew with actual chunks of meat, potatoes prepared in various ways, coffee, and occasionally dessert items. For men who had braced themselves mentally for gnawing hunger as a defining characteristic of captivity, the consistency and adequacy of these meals stood out as perhaps the most memorable feature of their imprisonment. Another crucial dimension to this abundance involved the logistics infrastructure that made it possible. The American supply chain during the global conflict achieved legendary status for its scope and reliability. Cargo vessels that transported tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft simultaneously carried countless tons of preserved food, ensuring that even in the most distant theaters of war, American troops, and by extension their prisoners, rarely experienced genuine hunger. By 1944, United States military logistics were supplying nearly 12 million people scattered across the globe with daily rations, an achievement of coordination and production that no other combatant nation could remotely match. The infrastructure enabling this feat was genuinely staggering in scale. Refrigerated railway cars, massive grain storage silos, cannery operations running on government contracts, and a civilian agricultural sector that had been mobilized to operate at maximum capacity all worked in concert. For German soldiers encountering this system firsthand through their own meals as prisoners, the implications were deeply unsettling. It revealed that America's war effort extended far beyond battlefields and bombing runs. It reached into commercial kitchens, manufacturing plants, and farming operations, creating a seamless network of production that guaranteed food security on a scale that would have seemed fantastical in Europe. Every tin of preserved meat, every box of crackers, every handful of those distinctively coloured chocolate candies served as tangible proof of an economy operating at full industrial throttle. The prisoners grasped that a nation capable of feeding millions of people so efficiently and reliably possessed the resources necessary to wage war indefinitely, without concern for material exhaustion. When POWs first opened their ration containers and examined the contents, they were not simply consuming calories. They were absorbing a profound message about American strength, industrial dominance, and the staggering asymmetry between the two sides of this conflict. The United States ration system transcended mere logistics. It functioned as a reflection of national power, morale maintenance, and industrial supremacy, all of which left an indelible impression on those who had steeled themselves for nothing but severe deprivation. When German prisoners of war were loaded onto ships for transport across the Atlantic, their journey provided yet another layer of revelation about American organizational capability and resource availability. By the later months of 1943, convoy operations carrying not only military equipment and fresh troops, but also thousands of captured Axis soldiers departed from various ports throughout North Africa and Britain, all bound for the continental United States. The sheer magnitude of this transportation operation was genuinely immense. Between 1943 and the conclusion of hostilities in 1945, more than 400,000 German prisoners made this crossing, eventually dispersed among nearly 700 separate detention facilities spread across the breadth of the United States. This represented a staggering logistical accomplishment, made feasible only through American naval dominance in the Atlantic and an uninterrupted supply corridor that ensured safe passage for these human cargoes. For numerous prisoners, the initial indications of difference emerged during the ocean voyage itself. Unlike transport vessels operated under Axis control, where conditions frequently verged on the brutal with overcrowding and minimal provisions, American ships maintained structured quarters, implemented regulated meal times, and enforced a level of systematic order that genuinely surprised men who had grown accustomed to improvisation and chaos throughout their European service. Soldiers who had endured the final collapse of the Africa Corps in Tunisia suddenly found themselves eating regular meals aboard Liberty ships and troop transports. Though quarters remained cramped by necessity, the voyage was not characterized by deliberate starvation or systematic neglect. For the Americans managing these operations, maintaining discipline required keeping even their captives adequately nourished and organized according to established procedures. Upon reaching ports such as Norfolk, Boston, and New York, prisoners underwent processing before being dispersed inland to their assigned detention facilities. What awaited them in the American interior bore virtually no resemblance to their darkest expectations. Camps established in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana were certainly surrounded by barbed wire fencing and watchtowers, but inside those perimeters, barracks buildings featured heating during winter months, food arrived on predictable schedules, and medical care was genuinely provided. German POWs had grown accustomed to the hardships that defined wartime Europe, where civilian populations often lacked adequate nutrition and basic services. Now they found themselves in a country that appeared essentially untouched by the scarcity that had become synonymous with the conflict. Rations included items many had not tasted in years: fresh milk, oranges and other citrus fruits, peanut butter, and white bread made from abundant American wheat harvests. That first meal, served within camp boundaries, frequently left profound impressions that lasted decades. Records from Camp Swift in Texas mention that newly arrived prisoners received beef stew, potatoes, various vegetables, coffee, and bread, a menu essentially comparable to what American soldiers themselves consumed. For prisoners who had marched through bombed-out Italian villages or desperately scavenged for turnips across the North African desert, the presence of a hot, calorie-dense meal served on schedule represented a moment of genuine disbelief. Many later testified in interviews and memoirs that this precise moment crystallized their realization that the United States fought an entirely different kind of war, one fueled by an economy not merely surviving, but actively thriving despite global conflict. The shock extended beyond the food itself to encompass the general abundance visible throughout these detention facilities. Farmers across the American Midwest supplied enormous quantities of grain, corn, and meat to support the war effort, and substantial amounts filtered down even to prisoner-of-war camps. Cattle herds grazing across Texas, wheat fields stretching across Kansas, and fruit orchards throughout California all contributed to a food supply network that absolutely dwarfed anything Germany could muster by 1944. For the prisoners, being served daily meals that included butter, something that had become genuinely scarce back in Germany by that point in the conflict, functioned as a visible, tactile reminder of American material plenty that seemed almost obscene in its generosity. Psychologically, this abundance created conflicting emotional responses. Many prisoners experienced genuine relief that captivity meant survival and reliable sustenance. Simultaneously, it served as a painful reminder of Germany's declining fortunes and deteriorating situation. Letters sent home, though censored by camp authorities, sometimes mentioned the surprising quality of food without directly contrasting it to the mounting shortages afflicting the homeland. Yet among the prisoners themselves, these comparisons became constant topics of quiet conversation. They privately acknowledged that America's demonstrated ability to feed not only its own massive military forces but also hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners revealed an overwhelming advantage that extended far beyond mere battlefield tactics. Within this environment of unexpected adequacy, the groundwork was being laid for what would prove the most surprising discovery of all. Sweets and candy integrated as standard components of military rationing. This development would culminate in moments when German POWs encountered small, distinctively coloured chocolates that symbolised not merely sugar and cocoa, but an entire culture built upon assumptions of abundance and industrial might. The moment German prisoners discovered candy among their rations marked a genuine turning point in their evolving perception of America and its capabilities. By 1944, the United States Army had fully integrated various confections into both soldier and prisoner diets, viewing them as essential elements for maintaining morale and providing quick energy. Among these sweets was a relatively new commercial product, M&Ms, first manufactured in 1941 following a partnership between Forrest Mars and Bruce Murray of the Hershey Corporation. Created with a hard sugar coating specifically designed to prevent melting even in hot climates, M&Ms proved perfectly suited for wartime distribution across diverse geographical regions. For American soldiers, they represented a portable treat that could be carried in pockets or packs without spoiling. For German prisoners of war, they were nothing short of an astonishing luxury that contrasted starkly with their vivid memories of deprivation back in the homeland. Multiple accounts from various detention camps record the genuine disbelief among prisoners when candy actually appeared on their meal trays or was distributed during special occasions. At Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, one prisoner later recalled that guards distributed small bags of chocolates as part of holiday meal services, something utterly unimaginable within the context of German military detention practices. Another captive at Camp Swift subsequently described his first taste of M&Ms as rekindling a childlike sense of wonder, noting that sweets had become genuinely rare even for German civilians after 1941 due to progressively stricter sugar rationing. To be given candy while living behind barbed wire fencing on foreign soil highlighted the surreal contrast between American overflowing supply networks and European shortages. The broader significance of candy within American rations transcended mere indulgence or luxury. The War Department viewed refined sugar as an efficient source of calories, easily packaged and distributed across long supply chains. Each serving of M&Ms or chocolate could deliver rapid energy during marches, construction assignments, or extended work shifts. When German POWs received assignments to agricultural labor throughout the American South and Midwest, small packets of sweets sometimes accompanied their midday meals. The underlying logic matched that applied to United States troops. Sugar could quickly revive exhausted men, making them more effective workers whether in combat or on work details. The prisoners' astonishment was compounded by the profound symbolism embedded in these bright, colourful candies. To men who instinctively associated warfare with scarcity and sacrifice, the very notion that America could allocate industrial resources toward producing millions of packages of candy, even during the height of global conflict, seemed almost absurd, bordering on wasteful decadence. In Germany, chocolate production had been drastically curtailed, with most available cocoa diverted exclusively to military use in limited, unpalatable forms like compressed emergency rations. Children back home rarely saw genuine sweets at all, and soldiers at the front considered them extraordinarily rare luxuries reserved for special circumstances. By contrast, the Americans were distributing them not only to their own forces, but even to enemy combatants held in captivity. This particular shock was not an isolated phenomenon. Red Cross inspectors visiting United States prisoner of war camps throughout 1944 consistently noted how American adherence to the Geneva Convention extended even to seemingly minor comforts such as sweets and desserts. Reports from camps in Nebraska and Texas specifically mentioned holiday meals that included pies, cakes, or allocated candy portions. German officers who had mentally prepared themselves for harsh discipline and minimal provisions were genuinely startled to observe their men receiving food that at times exceeded what German civilians could access in cities subjected to repeated Allied bombing campaigns. The M&Ms themselves became subjects of extended conversation and fascination within camp populations. Many German prisoners had never encountered such candy before their captivity. The sugar shell coating represented a genuine novelty, and the uniform colouring seemed almost artificial compared to the simpler sweet products available in pre-war Europe. Soldiers traded these candies among themselves, saved them as gifts for fellow prisoners, or simply marveled at the fact that America could mass-produce such treats during wartime without apparent strain on the economy. Later memoirs and recorded interviews frequently highlight this moment as among the most vivid memories of their entire captivity experience, functioning as a symbol carrying both humiliation and wonder simultaneously. Humiliation that their homeland was literally starving while their captors provided candy as if abundance represented the natural order of things, and wonder that such generosity was even possible under wartime conditions. For the Americans managing these camps, the gesture may have seemed relatively minor, just another line item in the provisioning budget. But for the prisoners receiving these colourful chocolate pieces, it carried immense psychological weight that resonated far beyond the momentary pleasure of sweetness. It delivered a vivid lesson about the reach and depth of American industrial capacity. This was a nation fighting war not only with tanks, aircraft, and artillery, but also with factories churning out millions of tiny chocolate candies engineered to survive desert heat and tropical humidity. For German prisoners gradually adjusting to life inside America's extensive network of detention facilities, sweets like M&Ms carried meaning that transcended mere taste or nutritional value. They represented, in tangible, edible form, a psychological dimension of military rationing that extended far beyond simple caloric requirements. Food was not merely fuel for the body, but also served as a morale booster, a subtle instrument of influence and control. American military planners had long recognized that something as seemingly insignificant as a chocolate bar or a small packet of candy could substantially lift spirits during grueling marches or sustained combat operations. When these same items filtered into prisoner of war camps, they played an unexpected but significant role in reshaping the mindset and attitudes of captured enemy soldiers. By 1944, psychologists and quartermaster personnel within the United States Army openly discussed and documented the morale function of candy and sweets. Internal reports circulated, noting that sugar acted simultaneously as both an immediate energy source and a psychological comfort, helping men endure stress, fatigue, and the emotional toll of military service. German POWs, conditioned by years of harsh propaganda rhetoric that portrayed America as decadent, weak, and materialistic, found it impossible to ignore the reality that their captors deliberately provided what could only be classified as luxuries specifically to sustain morale. Some prisoners quietly admitted among themselves that if America could afford to spare candy, even for enemy prisoners, its resource reserves must vastly exceed anything they had previously imagined. The effect of sweets on prisoner morale became particularly striking during holiday observances. In December 1944, at numerous camps throughout the Midwest, German prisoners received special holiday dinners that included roasted turkey, potatoes prepared multiple ways, various vegetables, and dessert portions often consisting of pies or candy distributions. For men who had left behind families enduring ration cards, blackout curtains, and bombing raids, the contrast was genuinely overwhelming. In their minds, candy symbolized not merely calories or even luxury, but an almost surreal generosity that contradicted everything they thought they knew about warfare and captivity. Diaries smuggled out of camps after the war's conclusion frequently mention Christmas candies as unforgettable experiences, with prisoners recalling how even the guards wished them Merry Christmas in German while distributing sweets. Beyond holiday celebrations, candy became integrated into work incentive systems. Prisoners assigned to agricultural labour or logging operations sometimes received small packets of confections at the conclusion of particularly long or demanding work days. This practice directly mirrored the use of sweets among American combat troops, where candy functioned as a quick morale boost following intense engagements. For German soldiers experiencing this treatment, however, it conveyed an additional layer of meaning. Their captors were treating them with a level of consideration that actively undermined the narratives they had absorbed while in uniform. Instead of encountering cruelty or deliberate deprivation, they experienced discipline combined with what could only be characterized as small kindnesses, embodied in something as simple as a handful of brightly colored chocolate pieces. The symbolism embedded within M&Ms and similar candies extended to even deeper levels of meaning. They embodied industrial strength and capacity, representing a kind of invisible power that Germany could no longer rival by that stage of the conflict. By 1944, sustained Allied bombing campaigns had systematically crippled German manufacturing facilities, forcing production to focus exclusively on bare essentials required for military survival. Civilians in Berlin, Hamburg, or other major cities stood in long queues for hours to obtain rationed bread or ersatz substitute goods of dubious quality. In sharp contrast, American assembly lines continued operating smoothly, churning out not only aircraft, tanks, and ammunition, but also millions of pounds of sugar-based products distributed to locations worldwide. For the prisoners, candy became a visible, undeniable marker of that fundamental imbalance in productive capacity. Testimonies collected during post-war interviews and research projects frequently reveal how much this apparently small detail lingered in memory decades later. One former prisoner recalled that eating candy during his captivity represented the first moment he truly realized Germany had lost not merely battles, but the entire economic foundation necessary for victory. The presence of sweets was not charity or accident, but part of a broader strategic approach demonstrating power through plenty, systematically breaking down enemy morale by contrasting it with calculated generosity. For German POWs, each sweet morsel was simultaneously a delight to the palate and a reminder of uncomfortable truths. America was fighting this war with resources so vast that even prisoners confined behind barbed wire could taste the industrial might of a nation located thousands of miles from any active combat zone. The astonishment German prisoners experienced when consuming candy in American detention camps only deepened once they began comparing their new reality with what they knew or heard about conditions elsewhere in Europe. By late 1944, circumstances for prisoners held in German custody or Soviet detention had reached extremes of deprivation that bordered on systematic extermination through neglect. In German-operated camps holding Soviet captives, mortality rates climbed as high as 50%, driven largely by deliberate starvation policies rooted in ideological contempt. Bread was extended with sawdust or potato peelings to stretch meagre supplies, while watery cabbage soup represented often the only daily sustenance. Soviet camps holding Axis prisoners operated under scarcely better conditions. Countless German soldiers sent eastward after capture died from malnutrition combined with exposure within months of their detention. Against this grim backdrop, American rations appeared almost surreal in their adequacy and consistent availability. One of the clearest contrasts manifested through the presence of sweets and refined sugar products. Throughout Europe, sugar ranked among the most heavily rationed commodities in every combatant nation. By 1943, German civilians received less than 1 pound of sugar monthly, and chocolate had virtually disappeared from retail shops altogether. Soldiers at the front occasionally received compressed chocolate bars, but these were bitter, high in fat content, and reserved exclusively for emergency situations. Civilians made do with ersatz substitutes concocted from roasted barley or processed beets, but genuine confections had become distant memories. In the Soviet Union, even basic bread remained scarce for much of the population, while sugar and candy existed as luxuries accessible only to party elites. To German prisoners in the United States, being handed M&Ms represented far more than a pleasant surprise or treat. It constituted a stark demonstration of how completely America had escaped the shortages ravaging every corner of Europe. Reports compiled by Red Cross inspections reinforced this disparity in vivid detail. Observers visiting United States prisoner facilities in 1944 and 1945 consistently noted not merely compliance with Geneva Convention minimum standards, but often conditions substantially exceeding those requirements. Men received 3 complete meals daily with adequate caloric content, and some camps even operated on-site bakeries and kitchens that produced fresh bread rather than relying exclusively on preserved goods. By contrast, inspection reports from camps in occupied Poland or deep within the Soviet Gulag system documented near-starvation diets, unsanitary conditions, and virtually no access to fresh food of any kind. German POWs who had harboured deep fears of potential Soviet capture whispered among themselves that ending up in American custody represented extraordinary fortune, perhaps even outright salvation from a far worse fate. The irony inherent in this situation was not lost on these men. Many had fought under leadership, spouting slogans proclaiming German superiority and American weakness, yet in captivity they encountered meals filled with actual meat, fresh vegetables, fruits when available, and astonishingly, candy distributed as if it were commonplace. Meanwhile, they knew their own families at home survived on meagre rations consisting of bread, margarine, and thin soups. Letters arriving from Germany told of children who had never tasted real chocolate, of families queuing for hours to obtain small portions of butter. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the industrial might of America allowed even enemy prisoners to taste genuine luxuries. The symbolic power of M&Ms within this broader contrast proved especially potent. To the prisoners, these candies embodied far more than simple calories or momentary pleasure. They illustrated with brutal clarity the economic imbalance underlying the entire conflict. Germany had lost access to cocoa imports after British naval forces successfully blockaded supply routes, while America continued drawing freely from sources throughout Latin America and West Africa with minimal difficulty. The demonstrated ability to transform these raw materials into millions of brightly packaged sweets distributed across the globe became a subtle yet powerful weapon in what might be termed psychological warfare. Each individual candy-coated chocolate piece served as proof that America not only fed its own population and military forces adequately, but could extend that abundance even to its captive enemies without strain. This stark disparity remained permanently etched in the memories of former prisoners long after the conflict's conclusion. In published memoirs and oral history recordings, many recalled the profound shock of realizing that their captors possessed access to goods their own homeland could not provide to free citizens living in major cities. Some even admitted that this discovery forced them to fundamentally re-evaluate everything they had been told throughout their military service about the nature of the war and the relative strength of the combatants. Where propaganda had consistently painted America as soft, decadent, and incapable of sustaining serious military effort, observed reality revealed an economy so powerful it could afford to indulge even its enemies during their confinement. In this manner, the simple presence of M&Ms in American military rations accomplished something beyond merely surprising captured soldiers. It revealed in the most basic, tangible terms imaginable the devastating contrast between a world characterized by material plenty and a continent slowly collapsing under the weight of comprehensive scarcity and resource exhaustion. Daily life inside American prisoner of war camps extended well beyond meal schedules, and the everyday routines highlighted just how profoundly different captivity was under United States control compared to what many Germans had anticipated based on their conditioning and propaganda. By 1944, camps distributed across Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and the Carolinas had developed highly structured daily schedules that combined mandatory work assignments, leisure time, and even educational opportunities. Food, including those surprising sweets like M&Ms, represented only one aspect of an environment deliberately designed to maintain order and productivity while meeting international legal obligations. Prisoners woke each morning to roll calls conducted with military precision, received their 3 daily meals on predictable schedules, and were subsequently assigned to various work duties that often directly supported the American war effort in unexpected ways. Agriculture represented the most common assignment for able-bodied prisoners. With millions of American men serving overseas in combat roles, farms throughout the Midwest and South faced severe labor shortages that threatened harvests. German POWs were transported daily under armed guard to fields where they harvested cotton, picked fruit from orchards, or loaded hay bales for livestock feed. In some documented cases, farmers grew genuinely fond of these additional workers, noting that the Germans typically worked diligently and efficiently, sometimes apparently motivated by the simple fact that they would be rewarded with substantial lunches and occasionally sweet treats packed into their midday meal boxes. For men who had steeled themselves expecting cruelty and harsh treatment, the opportunity to work outdoors under open skies, eat sandwiches and drink fresh milk, then finish the day with candy, seemed utterly bewildering. Many later remarked that the experience felt closer to ordinary civilian employment than to punishment or detention. Recreation also played a surprisingly important and deliberate role in camp life. Many facilities included sports fields where soccer matches, volleyball games, and even gymnastics exhibitions took place regularly. German teams organized themselves, scheduled competitions, with American guards occasionally watching from the sidelines as spectators. Libraries stocked with German language books circulated among the imprisoned men, and in numerous facilities, classes were offered covering subjects like English language instruction, mathematics, and even technical skills that might prove useful after repatriation. The underlying logic was pragmatic from the American perspective. Keeping prisoners mentally and physically occupied substantially reduced the likelihood of unrest, escape attempts, or disciplinary problems. But from the perspective of the POWs themselves, these opportunities reinforced the growing impression that their captors treated them with a level of basic respect that would have been unimaginable within European prison systems operated by any other power. Food consistently underscored and reinforced these daily experiences. Work details typically carried boxed lunches consisting of bread, some form of meat whether fresh or canned, fruit when available, and sweets in the form of candy bars or small packets of M&Ms intended to provide quick energy during afternoon labour. Personal diaries preserved and later studied by historians reveal a persistent sense of disbelief that even outside the barbed wire perimeter, labouring in agricultural fields under guard, prisoners could still reliably expect sugar rations. One former POW later wrote that chewing candy-coated chocolates while harvesting wheat across the Kansas plains represented one of the most profoundly surreal experiences of his entire captivity. Tangible proof that American wealth and productive capacity touched even the smallest details of daily existence. Another important dimension of camp life came through regular inspections conducted by the International Red Cross. Representatives visited facilities on established schedules, checking living conditions, reviewing food supplies and menus, and ensuring strict compliance with Geneva Convention requirements. Their detailed reports often praised the United States for maintaining genuinely humane standards, noting not only adequate meals meeting minimum caloric requirements, but also the inclusion of what could only be classified as occasional luxuries, sweets, fresh fruit when seasonally available, and baked desserts. These inspections provided reassurance to POWs that their treatment was not arbitrary or dependent on individual camp commanders, but rather part of a larger system of internationally monitored order and accountability. For many prisoners, the combination of structured work providing a sense of purpose, reliable and adequate meals, and unexpected comforts created deeply conflicting emotional responses. Some experienced genuine gratitude toward their captors, while others felt profound humiliation that they were living better than their own families back home. Nearly all, however, recognized and privately acknowledged the stark contrast with their own nation's collapsing infrastructure and failing supply networks. As one former POW recalled many years later, "We ate better in a Texas prison camp than our families did in Hamburg or Berlin." The regular presence of candy, though seemingly a minor detail in the larger picture, became a powerful symbol of this strange and uncomfortable reality. While technically prisoners of war, German soldiers were living with a degree of stability, consistent nourishment, and even small daily pleasures that fundamentally defied wartime expectations shaped by years of European scarcity. The routine distribution of candy was not an isolated gesture or random kindness, but rather part of a broader American culture of abundance that permeated every corner of society, extending even into its prison camp systems designed to hold enemy combatants. This cultural assumption of plenty, so foreign to European experience by that point in the war, would leave lasting impressions on men who would eventually return to a devastated homeland. When the war in Europe finally concluded in May 1945, the vast majority of German prisoners of war confined in the United States did not immediately return home. Most remained in captivity for additional months, with some not departing until early 1946 as logistics were arranged and political decisions finalized regarding repatriation. During this extended period, memories of their treatment and particularly their unexpected access to adequate food formed lasting impressions that many would carry throughout their remaining lives. Among the most enduring recollections was the persistent presence of sweets in their daily diets. For men who had left behind families struggling desperately with hunger and deprivation, the simple fact that they had regularly tasted candy while imprisoned behind barbed wire became a story they repeated for decades, often to disbelieving audiences back in Germany. Post-war interviews conducted by researchers and published memoirs revealed that M&Ms, which remained relatively novel even within the United States itself at that time, stood out with remarkable vividness in the minds of former prisoners of war. When describing their experiences in America to relatives, fellow veterans, or later to their own children, they frequently mentioned not tanks, aircraft, or even the battles they had fought, but rather the profound shock of being handed brightly coloured chocolates while living as defeated enemies. For these men, those small candies crystallized and symbolized the larger reality of American industrial abundance in a way that abstract statistics never could. One former soldier, interviewed many years after the conflict, remarked memorably that Germany fought its war with steel and blood, but America fought with factories and chocolate. The comment was less about the candy itself and more about what it represented. Industrial productive power so vast it could transform sugar, cocoa, and food dyes into millions of neatly packaged products, even during the absolute peak of global warfare. The symbolism extended well beyond food and material goods. Candy consumed during captivity fundamentally reshaped how many former POWs viewed the United States as a nation and a people. For some, it softened resentment and bitterness toward their former enemies. They contrasted their humane treatment with the ongoing devastation visible across their homeland upon return, and concluded that America represented not merely a victorious enemy, but a land characterized by prosperity, order, and a fundamentally different approach to governance and economics. Others interpreted the same experience as a form of humiliation, an uncomfortable reminder that their homeland could not even adequately feed its own children, while their captors casually distributed sweets to imprisoned enemies. Either way, regardless of individual emotional response, the impression proved lasting and influential. Historians studying the legacy and long-term impact of German prisoners of war held in America have noted that many returned to Europe carrying stories that directly contradicted years of propaganda messaging. Instead of recounting tales of brutality, systematic abuse, or deliberate starvation, they spoke of organized camps, steady and adequate meals, and yes, candy distributed as if it were unremarkable. These personal accounts influenced how West Germans in particular came to view the United States during the crucial post-war Reconstruction years. While broader political alliances were certainly shaped by Cold War dynamics and geopolitical considerations, the personal testimonies of hundreds of thousands of returning POWs contributed meaningfully to a gradual popular acceptance of American cultural and economic dominance in Western Europe. The story of M&Ms appearing in military rations became part of this larger narrative, functioning as a small but emotionally potent symbol of America's global reach and productive capacity. Meanwhile, within the United States itself, the war experience cemented candy's role as an essential component of military provisioning for decades to come. M&Ms, along with D-bars and other sweets distributed to both soldiers and prisoners alike during the conflict, had proven the tangible value of portable, morale-boosting foods that could withstand harsh conditions. After 1945, M&Ms experienced explosive growth in the civilian consumer market, riding a wave of brand recognition and positive associations earned during wartime military service. In this manner, the same candy that had surprised and astonished German prisoners also became a permanent post-war staple in American households, creating a direct link between military logistics and consumer culture that persists to the present day. For the Germans who had found themselves on the receiving end of this system, however, the memory carried different shades of meaning and emotion. In letters preserved by families, in diaries donated to archives, and in oral histories recorded decades after events, the recollection of M&Ms frequently surfaced alongside descriptions of seemingly endless fertile American farmland, consistently plentiful meals, and the general shock of encountering industrial modernity on a scale they had never imagined possible. It became a story they shared with children and grandchildren, a way of explaining that even in total defeat, even while confined behind barbed wire as enemies of the state, they had tasted something that symbolized and embodied the sheer overwhelming scale of American power and productive capacity. The legacy of those millions of candy packets distributed during wartime outlived the conflict itself by generations. They were never merely sweets or simple confections. They functioned as tokens of a comprehensive wartime system that showcased the industrial might, agricultural abundance, and cultural assumptions of the United States. For German prisoners of war, the surprise of encountering M&Ms represented far more than a moment of unexpected indulgence or pleasure. It opened a window into a profoundly different world, one that underscored simultaneously both their own nation's collapse into ruin and the unprecedented strength of the power that had defeated them. The memory of those small, colourful chocolates would remain with these men for the rest of their lives, a tangible reminder of the moment they realised the true scale of the forces arrayed against them and the fundamental asymmetry that had doomed their cause from the beginning.